Hey guys, tonight, we're diving into one of the greatest survival flexes in history. How Native Americans built teepees that stayed warm and comfortable at temperatures where modern humans start panicking because the thermostat dropped 3. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you imagine a home built to survive winters at 2s30, the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes question their life choices, you might picture something heavy, fortified, and aggressively unwelcoming. Thick stone walls, tiny windows, a fireplace so big it qualifies as a roommate. Basically, a medieval castle without the castle. But the people who actually thrived in that environment weren't living in stone cubes, they were living in tipis, elegant aerodynamic structures that look simple from a distance, but are secretly smarter than half the buildings we construct today. And let me be blunt, tipis don't get nearly enough credit. If Europeans had invented these things, they would have written operas about them. There would be paintings titled Ode to the Perfect Cone, entire architectural programs dedicated to the sacred geometry of portable warmth. But because this brilliance came from indigenous peoples, a shocking number of history books shrugged and say a kind of tent, a tent. That's like calling a NASA spacecraft a metal canoe with ambition. From the outside, a tipi looks clean and minimalist, the kind of design that would get posted on Pinterest under off-grid goals. But every inch of it exists because generations of people watched the land carefully and learned exactly how the wind, snow, and temperature behaved, not guessed, learned. Meanwhile, Europeans on the plains were building little square cabins that trapped smoke inside, like they were trying to hotbox themselves into the afterlife. What blows my mind is how perfectly the teepee works with the environment. It doesn't try to fight the wind, it slices through it. It doesn't try to hold snow, it shrugs it off like a buffalo having a bad morning. Modern houses could never. They see one snowflake and immediately panic about roof damage. The teepee's response, cute, try harder. And honestly, I admire that. It's architectural confidence. Here's my personal opinion. The teepee might be one of the smartest human inventions ever created. Portable, insulated, ventilated, warm in winter, cool in summer, easy to repair, easy to move. Even IKEA furniture can't compete with that list. And IKEA furniture comes with an instruction manual that looks like a hostage note. The teepee wasn't just a shelter, it was a survival machine, perfectly adapted, perfectly efficient, and perfectly suited to a world trying daily to freeze you into a decorative ice sculpture. And that, my friends, is why people inside a teepee stayed alive while winter outside screamed like it was auditioning for a horror movie. Before a teepee could become the warm, elegant winter powerhouse it needed a skeleton, and not the spooky Halloween kind. It needed poles, long ones, straight ones, strong ones. Fortunately, the Great Plains had exactly the right tree for the job. The lodgepole pine, a tree so perfectly designed for tipi construction that I suspect nature was showing off. Let's talk about these poles for a moment. They were tall, slim, lightweight, and surprisingly durable. Basically, the supermodels of the tree world. If you've ever tried to drag a giant wooden beam across a field, you know that lightweight and durable don't usually go together. But lodgepole pines pull it off. Honestly, trees shouldn't be allowed to have that kind of good genetics. The process of choosing poles wasn't random. People didn't just walk into the woods, point dramatically, and yell that one. They understood exactly which trees worked and which ones didn't. And here comes my personal opinion. This is where indigenous engineering truly humbles modern people. Most of us can't pick a ripe avocado without causing emotional distress. Yet, these communities selected structural materials with mathematical confidence. Once cut and prepared, the poles were arranged into a tripod, the foundation of the teepee. This tripod wasn't wobbly. It wasn't experimental. It wasn't, let's see if this holds. No, it was stable enough to withstand winter winds that could knock the personality out of a buffalo. And let's be honest, if your house can stay upright in a plains storm, you deserve a medal. After establishing the tripod, the remaining poles were placed around it in a precise spiral pattern. This wasn't just for looks, though it does look fantastic. The spiral helped distribute weight evenly, allowed snow to glide off gracefully, and created a cage-like structure strong enough to resist fierce gusts. This is the kind of engineering modern stadiums brag about. Except the teepee did it first, without steel, computers, or architectural firms charging outrageous consultation fees. Here's the part people never talk about. Lodgepole pine poles were reused for years, decades even. They traveled with families from camp to camp, winter to summer, across hunting grounds and seasonal sites. Imagine a house with reusable walls that don't fall apart 5 minutes after you assemble them, something IKEA users can only dream about. In short, the lodgepole pine wasn't just a tree, it was the backbone of the plains home, a perfect architectural gift from the environment. And honestly, modern buildings could learn a thing or two from those poles. The type's cone shape might look simple, almost too simple, but that's part of the design's evil genius. It's the kind of architectural brilliance that hides behind effortless elegance. You look at it and think, oh, nice triangle. But then winter arrives. The temperature drops to -30. The wind comes screaming across the plains like it's late for an appointment. And suddenly, that triangle is performing miracles. Let's start with the obvious. A cone is aerodynamic. A teepee doesn't fight the wind. It doesn't argue with the wind. It doesn't stubbornly insist on being a rectangle like European houses. No, it simply leans back and says, do your worst, while the wind slides up and over it like it's been emotionally dismissed. I've always believed that if European colonists had arrived with less architectural ego and more willingness to observe, they would have stared at the teepee and said, oh, so that's how you avoid freezing to death. But no, they built boxes, cold boxes, smoky boxes, boxes that leaked heat like they were trying to cool the entire continent. Meanwhile, the teepee, with nothing more than poles and hides, behaved like it had a degree in aerodynamics. One of the most impressive features of the cone shape is its ability to shed snow. Snow doesn't pile up politely on the roof, it slides right off. This prevents the teepee from collapsing underweight and creates a kind of built-in maintenance system. You don't have to climb onto your roof with a shovel, scream into the void, and wonder why you chose to live somewhere cold. The teepee takes care of itself. The shape also influences heat distribution. Warm air naturally rises, and inside a teepee, it circulates in a spiraling motion upward through the center, then down along the walls. The result? Even heating. No freezing corners, no cold drafts stabbing you in the kidneys while you sleep. I can't say the same for most modern apartments. Let's not forget stability. A teepee can handle storms that would rip a colonial house apart like a toddler opening a gift. The cone-shaped channels stress downward through the poles into the ground. This is why teepees bend, flex, and survive instead of breaking. A building doesn't need to defeat nature. It needs to cooperate with it. Here's my personal opinion. If the cone shape had been invented in Europe, architects would still be bragging about it today. There would be statues, parades, a national holiday dedicated to the holy cone of structural integrity. But indigenous nations perfected it quietly, efficiently, and beautifully. Because the goal wasn't praise, the goal was survival, and the cone delivered. Once the teepee's wooden skeleton stood proudly against the plains wind, looking like the world's most intimidating tripod. It was time to dress it, and not with just any material. No flimsy cloth, no sad colonial canvas, no we hope this works fabric. Teepees were wrapped in buffalo hides, one of nature's greatest winter inventions, and honestly, better insulation than half of what modern outdoor stores sell for outrageous prices. Let me be clear. Buffalo hides weren't chosen because they were convenient. they were chosen because they were perfect. A buffalo is basically a walking furnace wrapped in fur and muscle, surviving winters so cold, even the snow considered relocating. If an animal can shrug at us 30, like it's early autumn, its hide is absolutely the thing you want surrounding your home. Sewing the hides together was an art form. It wasn't grab a needle and hope for the best. It took skill, patience, and generations of perfected technique. The hides were softened, shaped, and stitched using sinew, durable, flexible, and far superior to most threads found today. I personally believe modern sewing tools would cry if they saw what sinew could do. You could lasso a small car with that stuff. Once sewn, the covering became a single massive sheet, a winter cloak large enough to shame any medieval king. Draping it over the tipi wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was done in a specific sequence, aligning the seams so wind flowed over them instead of through them. These were the details Europeans didn't understand. They thought homes needed thick logs, bricks, and prayers. Meanwhile, native nations were creating an aerodynamic, insulated, weatherproof masterpiece with hides and knowledge. One of my favorite aspects is how the hide covering wasn't just functional, it was adaptable. In winter, extra hides could be added for more insulation. In summer, sections could be rolled up to allow airflow. Meanwhile, most European settlers spent winter alternately freezing and smoking themselves out of their cabins, wondering what mysterious force prevented comfortable living. Spoiler, it was poor design. And here's a personal opinion no one asked for, but I'll say anyway. The buffalo hide covering might be the most elegant example of using the land without abusing the land. The hides were a gift, not a resource to exploit endlessly, but something to respect, use wisely, and honor. The final result, a teepee wrapped so tightly and intelligently that even roaring winter winds had to take a moment and say, well, all right, fair enough. If you've ever seen a buffalo up close, you know two things immediately. 1, it is enormous, and 2, it is dressed for winter like it's preparing to battle the Ice Age directly. Buffalo hides weren't just warm, they were absurdly warm, unfairly warm. Warm in a way that makes you question why modern winter jackets cost so much and perform so little. I've worn jackets marketed as windproof, thermal, or Arctic grade, and somehow a buffalo in January still looks more comfortable than I do walking to the mailbox. And this is exactly why buffalo hides formed the winter armor of the teepee. A buffalo spent its whole life outdoors, casually existing at temperatures that make humans panic. -30. That's Tuesday for a buffalo. The fur is dense, the hide thick, and the insulation qualities are so good that snow falling on a buffalo doesn't even melt, meaning its body is holding heat that efficiently. That's not biology, that's a flex. So, imagine stitching multiple hides together into one giant, weatherproof cover. It was like wrapping your entire home in the North American equivalent of a luxury polar survival suit. But unlike modern clothing companies, the buffalo didn't try to upsell you with phrases like ultralight, breathable, or revolutionary fabric technology. The hide simply said, I will keep you alive, you're welcome. Another thing I personally love, the hides weren't used wastefully. Nothing on a buffalo was thrown away. Meat, bones, sinew, fat, hooves, everything had a purpose. The hides were treated, softened, tanned, and prepared with knowledge accumulated over hundreds of generations. People today struggle to assemble a bookshelf from a Scandinavian furniture store. Meanwhile, these communities were turning massive animal hides into airtight, winter-ready home insulation. The hide's thickness made them excellent at blocking wind. And if you've never stood on the Great Plains during a winter storm, allow me to describe it. The wind does not blow, it attacks. It behaves like it has unresolved emotional issues. It finds every gap, every crack, every weakness. Buffalo hide handled that wind like a veteran bouncer at a rowdy tavern. No entry, move along. The best part, a buffalo hide tipi didn't just keep warmth in, it kept moisture out. Snow slid off instead of sticking. Rain beaded and rolled away. This wasn't primitive technology. This was highly refined environmental engineering. My personal opinion, if buffalo hide insulation were sold today, it would cost a fortune, be marketed as artisan, eco-friendly thermal shielding, and instantly sell out to wealthy people who claim to love nature but panic when they see an actual insect. The teepee didn't just use buffalo hides, it maximized their genius. If the buffalo hide exterior was the teepee's heavy winter coat, then the inner lining was the hidden layer of engineering genius that most people never notice. At first glance, it looks simple, just another layer of hide or cloth hanging on the inside walls. But in reality, this lining transformed the teepee from very good shelter into how is this warmer than a colonial cabin built by a dozen men with axes and hope. The lining created a double-wall insulation system. This wasn't guesswork. It was intentional, refined through generations. One layer of hide on the outside kept out wind, snow, and whatever weather was currently trying to ruin someone's week. The inner lining, suspended several inches inside, created a pocket of air between the two layers. That air pocket functioned exactly like the insulation in modern homes, except without fiberglass, foam, or the existential dread of home repair bills. When the central fire burned, warm air rose naturally and slipped upward between the lining and the outer cover, circulating in a controlled cycle. Instead of escaping into the night or getting trapped at the top of the teepee, that warm air was guided downward along the interior, maintaining a consistent and comfortable temperature inside. The result was a convection system so efficient that even harsh winter temperatures outside could not penetrate the living space. The inner lining also played a key role in smoke management. Smoke from the central fire didn't drift sideways across the floor, making everyone cough like they were auditioning for a 19th century consumption drama. Instead, the lining funneled the smoke upward toward the smoke hole, where the adjustable flaps allowed it to escape. The system balanced airflow. Fresh air entered from the bottom edge of the teepee, warmed from the fire and inner air pocket, and rose upward, pushing smoke out while keeping heat in. From a practical standpoint, the lining also prevented drafts from racing along the ground, a problem that plagued European-style dwellings. Cold air simply couldn't sweep across the floor when the lining gently redirected it upward into the warm airflow. Floors covered with hides and mats benefited even more from this controlled movement, creating a surprisingly cozy environment. The brilliance of the lining came from its adaptability. In winter, it could be lowered fully to trap heat. In summer, it could be raised for ventilation. Everything about it was adjustable, responsive, and designed to work with natural forces rather than against them. No excess materials, no wasted space, no battles with the weather. Just smart, efficient engineering woven deeply into everyday life. At the top of every teepee sits one of its most overlooked yet brilliant features, the smoke flaps. To an untrained eye, they might appear decorative, two triangular pieces of hide flapping politely in the wind. But to anyone who has ever lived through a winter fire in an enclosed space, these flaps are nothing short of heroic. They are, in essence, the type's climate control system. Centuries before anyone invented thermostats, chimneys, or the modern obsession with smart home technology, the smoke flaps controlled the ventilation of the teepee. When the central fire burned, usually small, steady, and well managed, it produced smoke that naturally rose toward the top of the structure. Without a way to guide that smoke out, the interior would quickly resemble a wood-fired sauna gone terribly wrong. But the flaps directed the smoke upward and outward, functioning like an adjustable chimney. By using two long poles, the flaps could be opened, closed, or angled in specific directions, depending on the wind. If the wind shifted, which it often did on the plains, usually with the enthusiasm of someone slamming a door, the flaps could be repositioned to ensure smoke escaped efficiently. This allowed fresh air to enter from the bottom, while warm air circulated in a controlled pattern. What makes this design especially clever is how responsive it is. The flaps didn't require ropes, gears, pulley, or complicated mechanical systems. They required 2 poles and the understanding of how the wind behaved. With a quick adjustment, the entire airflow of the teepee could be changed. Meanwhile, European settlers were building square houses with chimneys that frequently clogged, smoked, or collapsed under snow because they were not designed with local conditions in mind. The smoke flaps also played a key role in temperature regulation. Open them wide and heat escapes, cooling the teepee during warmer seasons. Narrow them, and the teepee retains warmth more effectively. In winter, when temperatures dropped to -30 and the world outside felt like a hostile refrigerator, careful flap adjustments ensured the interior stayed warm without suffocating the occupants. Their placement at the peak of the cone was intentional. The rising warm air created a natural draft that pulled smoke upward. The flaps, acting as directional vents, used this upward flow to clean the air inside while maintaining comfort. No trapped smoke, no wasted heat, no need to build a chimney taller than the house itself. In short, the smoke flaps transformed the top of the teepee from just an opening into a dynamic, elegant, low-tech masterpiece of environmental control. Simple, effective, reliable. A solution so intelligent that even today, architects study it with interest and maybe a touch of envy. At the heart of every teepee literally and metaphorically burned a small, steady fire. Not a roaring bonfire, not a dramatic blaze worthy of a fantasy movie, but a carefully controlled hearth that provided warmth, light, and a place to cook without turning the entire structure into a smoke chamber or an emergency situation. The central hearth was the quiet workhorse of teepee life, doing everything a European fireplace did, but with far fewer structural complaints. The placement of the fire in the exact center was no accident. It ensured even heat distribution, efficient smoke movement, and safe distance from the walls. If you've ever lit a fire too close to something flammable, like a curtain, a log cabin wall, or your own dignity, you'll understand the importance of this design choice. The teepee's geometry allowed the fire's heat to rise straight upward, gather beneath the smoke hole, and move through the warm air channels created by the inner lining. A small fire was more than enough. The teepee didn't need a massive blaze to maintain warmth. A modest flame could keep the interior surprisingly comfortable, something that baffled early European observers who assumed you needed to build a fire large enough to melt the Arctic. Instead, the teepee relied on efficiency rather than brute force, which is a lesson modern heating systems could stand to relearn. The hearth was multifunctional. It provided light at night, heat for cooking, and warmth for sleeping. Pots could hang above it. Food could be roasted beside it, and in emergencies, it doubled as a primitive drying machine, essential in a climate where wet clothing was not merely an inconvenience, but a potential health hazard. Despite all this utility, the fire remained remarkably contained. The smoke hole and flaps prevented buildup, and the lining helped direct air upward, ensuring that the inhabitants weren't constantly coughing or squinting through a fog of burnt wood. But perhaps the most impressive part of the hearth system was how well it cooperated with the type's shape. As warm air rose, it created a natural current that drew fresh air from the bottom edge of the tip. This created a self-sustaining ventilation cycle that required no chimneys, no metal pipes, and no winter trips onto icy rooftops to unclog anything. It was easy to maintain and quick to adjust. It was, simply put, a perfect example of achieving comfort and survival through thoughtful design. Rather than overwhelming force, the central hearth didn't dominate the teepee. It harmonized with it. Life inside a winter teepee wasn't just warm. It was organized, intentional, and surprisingly comfortable. If you've ever lived in a modern apartment designed by someone who apparently hates humans, you'll appreciate how well the interior of a teepee made use of space. Nothing was random. Nothing was shoved into a corner just because everything had a purpose, and that purpose usually supported warmth, togetherness, or survival, preferably all three. The interior layout followed a practical logic developed over generations. Sleeping areas were placed around the edges where hides and furs insulated the ground from the bitter cold outside. This ring of bedding created both warmth and a natural boundary, giving each person a personal space, despite the open floor plan. And honestly, it was more space efficient than most studio apartments. Plus, no one was arguing with a landlord about heating. At the center sat the hearth, the teepee's sun, the gravity well around which daily life orbited. People gathered there to cook, talk, make tools, repair clothing, tell stories, and occasionally contemplate why the wind outside sounded like it was trying to file a complaint. The circular arrangement encouraged eye contact and conversation, something designers of open-concept homes keep trying and failing to recreate. What made the tipi so effective as a communal space was how equal the interior felt. There were no cold corners, no isolated nooks, and no darker, slightly suspicious areas, like in a log cabin. The entire space was warmed by the convection created between the inner lining and outer cover. This meant no one was ever forced to sleep in the drafty zone, also known as the spot Europeans assigned to their least favorite family members. Hooks, poles, and lines allowed belongings to be stored efficiently along the walls. Tools, clothing, bags, cooking items, all had their place. Even drying racks for wet gear could be suspended from the poles above, taking advantage of rising warm air. A teepee could transform between a living room, bedroom, workshop, kitchen, and gathering hall without ever feeling cramped. But the real magic was how the structure supported social connection. The warmth invited conversation. The circular shape encouraged participation. The open space allowed for rituals, storytelling, teaching, singing, and laughter, all while the storm outside raged like an angry opera singer. A winter teepee was not just a shelter. It was a living, breathing community space. A place where families didn't just survive the cold, they shared life within it. One of the most underrated achievements of the winter teepee wasn't the aerodynamic design, the smoke control engineering, or even the buffalo hide insulation. No, it was the fact that people inside weren't forced to sit, sleep, or walk on frozen ground like reluctant penguins. The floor of a winter teepee was its own system of insulation, comfort, and practical design, turning icy soil into something surprisingly warm and livable in -30. That's nothing short of a small miracle. The foundation of the floor was a layer of brush, grass, or mats laid down to create separation between the earth and the living space. This first layer acted like a buffer zone, the diplomatic negotiator, keeping the freezing ground from declaring war on everyone's feet. Placing brush or mats directly on the soil also prevented moisture from creeping upward, which is important because there are few things more unpleasant in winter than discovering your bedding has become a sponge. On top of this first layer came animal hides, especially buffalo robes or deer hides. These hides provided not only warmth but softness, a huge upgrade from the harder surfaces found in European cabins of the same era. Even today, stepping onto a warm fur surface on a cold morning feels luxurious. In a teepee, it wasn't luxury, it was survival with style. These hides also created an insulating pocket, similar to modern flooring techniques. Warm air circulated downward from the central fire and radiated across the floor layers, keeping the space beneath sleeping areas surprisingly pleasant. This wasn't just better than the cold ground, it was genuinely warm, the kind of warm where you can sit comfortably while the world outside tries its best impression of a frozen wasteland. Another clever feature was how flexible the floor setup was. If conditions changed, more people arrived, whether shifted or storage needed to be reorganized. Hides could be rearranged easily. Sleeping areas could be expanded or tightened. Additional furs could be layered for extra insulation. The floor was not a static element. It adapted as efficiently as the teepee itself, and there was a practical hygiene advantage, too. If snow or mud got tracked inside, and let's be honest, someone always tracks something inside, the hides could be lifted, shaken, cleaned, or dried near the fire. Try doing that with a colonial wooden floor. Spoiler, it doesn't go well. Altogether, the floor system worked harmoniously with the teepee's thermal design. Heat rising from the hearth, Insulation from the hides, airflow from the lining. Everything protected the family from the brutal cold outside. So, while the wind tried to turn the plains into a frozen battlefield, the people inside sat on warm ground, wrapped in comfort, proving once again that good design beats brute force every time. One of the most astonishing features of the teepee wasn't how warm it stayed, how cleverly it ventilated smoke, or how beautifully it handled -30. No, the real plot twist is that the entire structure was portable, and not technically portable the way modern furniture claims to be, which usually means you'll regret this in 10 minutes. The teepee was truly portable. Easy to take down, quick to pack, simple to move, and fast to rebuild. In other words, it was everything a European cabin was not. A well-practiced family could dismantle a teepee in under an hour. The poles were unlashed, the hide covering folded, the interior lining packed, and the household items bundled efficiently. No nails to pry out, no beams to struggle with, no roofs collapsing halfway through the process. The design recognized something Europeans often forgot. Humans move, animals migrate, seasons change, food sources shift. A home should adapt to life, not chain people to a single location. Once disassembled, the teepee components were transported using a travois, a simple yet effective sled-like frame pulled by dogs in earlier periods and horses after their introduction. The poles themselves often doubled as the travois rails, proving again that every part of the teepee had multiple uses. Nothing was wasted, nothing was decorative. Everything served a purpose. Meanwhile, European settlers were busy chopping down forests to build wooden houses they abandoned a year later because they placed them in terrible locations. But what truly sets the teepee apart is how quickly it could be rebuilt. The same family who took it down in under an hour could have it standing again by midday, poles arranged, hide covering secured, lining hung, half hearth lit. Imagine relocating your entire home in the time it takes most people to assemble a single piece of flat-pack furniture. And without the emotional damage, mobility was not a luxury. It was essential to the rhythm of life. Hunting patterns, seasons, water availability, and resource cycles demanded movement. The teepee allowed families to follow the land without sacrificing comfort. No need to choose between warmth and mobility. No need to drag a wooden cabin across the plains like a particularly uncooperative pet. The types solved the problem elegantly. Your home moves with you, not against you. Portability also strengthened community bonds. Camps could come together, expand, merge, or divide as needed. Families could join seasonal gatherings, ceremonies, or hunts, knowing their homes could be packed and ready at a moment's notice. In a world shaped by the vastness of the plains, the teepee's mobility wasn't just convenience, it was survival made simple. If you've ever lived in a house with a poorly sealed front door, you know how a single draft can undo an entire heating system. Now imagine dealing with that draft ATS-30 when the wind is coming at you sideways, like it's personally offended by your existence. The entrance of a winter teepee had to handle exactly that, and it did so with a kind of quiet, confident brilliance that modern architects could learn from. The first line of defense was orientation. Teepees traditionally faced east, away from the prevailing western winds that barreled across the plains with the subtlety of an angry bear. This wasn't superstition, it was meteorology practiced long before meteorologists went on television to gesticulate dramatically at animated weather maps. By facing east, the teepee reduced exposure to the most aggressive gusts, turning the doorway into a controlled entry instead of a wind tunnel. Next came the door flap, a hide covering that acted like a flexible but surprisingly effective shield. It could be lifted, tied back, weighted, doubled, or layered, depending on the season. Unlike a rigid wooden door, the flap moved with the wind instead of resisting it, preventing stress on the structure and reducing the risk of cold air barging inside uninvited. During harsh winter storms, a second flap or additional insulation could be added behind the main door, creating a miniature airlock. This Tulier system trapped cold air before it entered the main space, performing the Same function as modern vestibules, but without the need for power strips, heaters, or awkward "please close both doors" signs. Inside the entrance, the teepee's interior lining also played a role. The lining didn't extend all the way to the doorway, but its presence helped redirect cold air downward, preventing it from sweeping into the living area. Any gust that managed to sneak past the flap was forced to behave, diverted into the airflow system, where it became part of the natural convection rather than an unwanted blast of Arctic personality. Another clever detail was how low the doorway was. Yes, this meant you had to bend a bit to go in and out. But given the choice between a dignified posture and not freezing to death, most people picked warmth over elegance. The low entrance prevented large volumes of warm air from escaping each time someone entered or exited. Altogether, the design turned what could have been a structural weakness into a functional strength. The entrance was not just a hole in the wall. It was an engineered barrier against the worst winter could offer. In a climate where one bad draft could ruin an entire night, the tippy door didn't just keep cold out, it kept comfort in. Stepping inside a well-built winter tippy during -30 is a bit like stepping into a plot twist. You expect suffering. You expect your eyelashes to freeze. You expect the kind of cold that makes your bones file formal complaints. Instead, you find warmth, real warmth, and a level of comfort that would make many European settlers stare in stunned silence, followed by the quiet internal acknowledgement that they had been living all wrong. A winter tippy didn't just block the cold, it created an interior microclimate. Between the buffalo hide exterior, the insulated inner lining, the central hearth, and the carefully managed airflow, the temperature inside could be so comfortable that people removed outer layers, worked freely, and slept without shaking like poorly wrapped burritos. This level of environmental control, achieved with no metal stoves, no electric heaters, and no stack of firewood the size of a small village, remains one of the most impressive achievements of indigenous engineering. Light came from the hearth and filtered through the hide covering, giving the space a warm amber glow, like choosing the cozy lighting option on a smart bulb, except the bulb is your entire home. Shadows danced softly along the walls, creating a flickering atmosphere perfect for storytelling, teaching, crafting tools, or simply passing time. While the outside world attempted to freeze itself solid, storage hung neatly from the poles, keeping tools, bags, and belongings off the ground. This added organization also helped maintain airflow around the walls, preserving the convection system that made the types so effective. Nothing felt cluttered. Nothing felt cramped. It was a space shaped intentionally, not an accidental assortment of objects fighting for territory, which, let's be honest, describes many modern living rooms. Sleeping areas formed a ring along the outer edge, layered with hides and furs for insulation. These sleeping spots stayed noticeably warmer than the central walkway, thanks to the E-floor system working in harmony with the heated airflow. Families could rest peacefully, wrapped in warmth, while blizzards roared outside with the enthusiasm of a choir of disgruntled wolves. What might surprise modern audiences most is just how livable the space felt. This wasn't surviving in the bare minimum sense. This was living, cooking, repairing clothing, crafting tools, singing, sharing stories, teaching lessons, and preparing food. Daily life continued seamlessly, unaffected by the howling cold beyond the teepee walls. The winter teepee didn't merely protect people from the environment. It created a refuge, a bubble of warmth and community in a world that demanded resilience. A home where life continued even as winter tried its absolute best to stop it. When European settlers first encountered winter teepees, many of them had the same reaction someone has when they realized their expensive high-tech phone can't do something a cheap, older model does effortlessly. Confusion, denial, and eventually grudging respect. Up to that point, most Europeans assumed that proper houses required heavy timber, thick walls, small windows, and enough smoke inside to make every meal taste like an accidental barbecue. The teepee quietly disagreed, and then proceeded to outperform these houses in almost every category that mattered in -30. Take the average settler cabin, built quickly, often with limited knowledge of the local climate. It tended to have gaps between logs large enough to qualify as part-time entry points for wind. The roofs leaked, the chimneys smoked, the floors froze, the wind whistled through the walls like a judgmental dinner guest. And each winter, families discovered new and exciting ways to regret their architectural decisions. Compare that to a winter teepee. Aerodynamic, insulated, portable, breathable, warm, and structurally flexible. The teepee wasn't trying to wrestle with the wind. It redirected it. It didn't trap smoke inside until half the family coughed themselves to sleep. It vented cleanly through an adjustable system. It didn't collapse when a heavy snowfall arrived. It shed the weight so effortlessly that even gravity seemed impressed. Even heating efficiency favored the teepee. A single small fire could warm the entire interior without wasting fuel. Meanwhile, European settlers needed piles of wood that could double as small fortifications just to keep their homes at a temperature slightly above Arctic misery. They spent entire days chopping wood, stacking wood, and arguing about whether they had enough wood, all while the teepee's inhabitants simply tended a modest fire and got on with their lives. Then there's mobility, which was completely foreign to European architecture. Once a cabin was built, it was married to that piece of land forever. For better or worse, mostly worse during harsh seasons. If hunting patterns shifted or water sources moved, too bad. The house stayed put. The family froze. The teepee, however, could be taken down, transported, and rebuilt in a new location, usually faster than a settler could find a replacement axe handle. What truly highlights the contrast is how each structure responded to the environment. Settler houses fought nature and lost repeatedly. Teepee worked with nature and thrived. In the end, one wasn't simply a shelter. It was a system perfected for the plains. The other was a wooden box, full of regrets. When you step back and look at all the elements of the winter teepee, the aerodynamic cone, the buffalo hide insulation, the inner lining, the smoke flap, ventilation, the warm floor system, the central hearth, the directional entrance, the portability, the picture becomes clear. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a masterpiece of human adaptation, quietly perfected through generations of observation, testing, and refinement. A kind of architectural wisdom the environment itself helped shape. Most structures around the world evolve by accident. Someone builds a house, realizes the roof leaks, makes adjustments, and the cycle continues until the building stops falling on people. But the teepee didn't stumble its way into greatness. Every component was deliberate. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was overbuilt. Nothing required a miracle to function in -30. It was the opposite of trial and error architecture. It was trial and excellence. The genius lies in how all the pieces worked together. The shape supported the airflow. The lining supported the heating. The hides supported the insulation. The poles supported the portability. The entrance supported the wind direction, instead of forcing the environment to obey human preference, which is a strategy that usually ends with rickety buildings and disappointed settlers. The teepee cooperated with nature. It took what the plains offered and replied, "Yes, that works for us." It's a stark contrast to the European approach of the time, which essentially consisted of build box, hope box survives. If box collapses, build another box somewhere nearby, and repeat mistake. Meanwhile, the teepee was demonstrating fluidity, adaptability, and efficiency long before those words ever became buzzwords in engineering seminars. The teepee also thrived because it wasn't just a structure. It was integrated into a way of life. It supported mobility, community, seasonal movement, hunting cycles, climatic variation, and spiritual practices. A house wasn't simply a place to sleep. It enabled families and entire nations to follow the rhythms of the land. When winter tightened its grip, the teepee didn't resist the cold. It outsmarted it. Even modern architects studying sustainable design often find themselves quietly impressed. Not that many will admit their most admired climate-responsive structure is centuries old and made without metal screws or reinforced concrete. but the truth is unavoidable. The teepee remains one of the most efficient portable dwellings ever engineered. In the end, the winter teepee didn't merely keep people alive, 30. It allowed them to live well, warm, resilient, and in harmony with a landscape powerful enough to punish any design flaws. That is the beauty of the teepee, a humble shape, a simple frame, and a brilliance that still echoes today. In the far north, winter never arrived quietly. It descended like a slow-moving beast, stealing minutes of daylight one by one until the sun barely skimmed the horizon. 4 Viking communities scattered across Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. These darkest weeks of the year were more than an inconvenience. They were a test of endurance. Crops were long harvested, the seas were treacherous, and the world outside the longhouse felt frozen in time. This was the backdrop for Joel, the Ule season, a festival created not simply for celebration, but for survival of the spirit. As the longest night approached, people marked the shift with a mixture of dread and determination. The sun in their eyes wasn't merely hiding, it was weakening. Each shortened day hinted at a cosmic struggle between light and the forces that sought to swallow it. And while the Vikings were famously pragmatic, they were equally spiritual, believing deeply in unseen powers that governed the rhythm of the world. Joel gave them a way to influence that rhythm, or at least feel as though they could. Through rituals, fire, feasting, sacrifice, and storytelling, they attempted to call the sun back from the edges of the void. Preparation began weeks beforehand. Families dried meat, brewed meat, and brought livestock into warm enclosures, selecting the strongest animals for breeding and the weakest for inevitable slaughter. But one creature held special significance: the boar. Robust, stubborn, and sacred to the god Freyr, the boar embodied fertility, strength, and renewal, everything the community longed for during winter's deepest chill. To sacrifice a boar at Yule was to symbolically feed the cycle of nature, an offering meant to coax the returning sun toward its rebirth. Inside the long house, anticipation grew. Fresh pine branches decorated the pillars, their scent mingling with woodsome smoke. Children were told stories of ancient winters, heroic ancestors, and gods who fought against frost giants to preserve the world. The crackling hearth became the center of existence, radiating not just warmth, but reassurance. As long as the fire burned, so did hope. And that was the heart of Yule. In a world where darkness felt eternal, the Vikings dared to gather, feast, and honor the turning of the year. They believed that even the smallest flame, whether in a hearth or a heart, could challenge the longest night and usher in the slow, triumphant return of the sun. At the heart of Joel stood one ritual more sacred than any other: the sacrifice of the boar, dedicated to Freyr, the Vanir god of fertility, peace, and prosperity. To the Vikings, Freyr wasn't just a deity. He was the guarantor of the coming year's harvest, the quiet force behind warm summers, fertile fields, and the renewal of all living things. In the cold grip of winter, when food stores dwindled and daylight faded, honoring Freya became a matter of both reverence and survival. The chosen boar, often the finest animal a household could produce, was treated with immense respect. In some regions, it was groomed and adorned with wreaths or ribbons, a symbolic gesture acknowledging its role in sustaining the community. This was not a mindless act of slaughter. It was a solemn exchange, life given in hopes that life would continue. Before the sacrifice, the boar was led before the assembled clan, where each person laid a hand on its bristled back and swore a Ule oath, promises of bravery, intentions for the coming season, or vows to settle feuds once the snows melted. These oaths, spoken in the presence of the gods, ancestors, and kin, were binding. Breaking them brought dishonor and worse, divine disfavor. Once the sacrifice was complete, the blood of the boar was collected and sprinkled on carved wooden idols, ceremonial stones, and even the participants themselves. This act, known as Bali, was believed to strengthen the bond between mortals and the divine. The meat was then roasted over an open fire, its scent mingling with pine and smoke, filling the long house with a richness that momentarily erased the harshness outside. The feast that followed was communal, every slice of boar carrying symbolic weight. Eating it meant partaking in Freya's blessing, sharing in the hope that fields would flourish again and that the sun would regain its strength. Children were told that the boar's spirit would run across the skies, guiding the returning light back toward the world of humans. In this way, the boar sacrifice was more than a ritual. It was a covenant, a promise that the Vikings would endure winter's darkness with resolve, and a plea that the gods in turn would reward their devotion with abundance when spring returned. If the boar sacrifice was the sacred heart of Joel, me was its golden lifeblood. In the Viking imagination, me wasn't just a drink. It was a gift from the gods, a symbol of celebration, creativity, and communal strength. Brewed from honey, water, and often flavored with herbs or berries, me represented the stored sweetness of the year, captured sunlight, transformed into liquid warmth. And there was no better time to release that warmth than in the frozen depths of winter. Inside the longhouse, the mead flowed freely. Massive drinking horns, often carved with patterns of serpents and runes, were passed hand to hand. Each person drank in turn, guided by ritual and etiquette that reinforced solidarity. No one drank alone. A horn raised was an invitation, sometimes to toast the gods, sometimes to honor ancestors, and sometimes simply to express gratitude for surviving another year. The Vikings believed that shared drink bound people together, dissolving the boundaries that hardship tended to build. As the fire roared in the central hearth, the longhouse came alive. Shadows danced along timbered beams, flickering like spirits that had joined the gathering. Me loosened tongues, thawed frozen spirits, and transformed the solemnity of sacrifice into celebration. Faces flushed with heat and drink. Warriors recounted battles with playful exaggeration. Fishermen bragged about storms survived, and farmers predicted next year's harvest with bold optimism. Laughter grew louder as the night deepened, and for a few precious hours the struggles of winter felt distant. But me drinking wasn't merely indulgence. It was a ritualized release of tension, a psychological shield against the crushing monotony of the season. Each hornful offered courage. Courage to endure the cold. Courage to face the uncertainty of the months ahead, and courage to hope for renewal. Even the Sholds, the storytellers and poets, depended on me for inspiration, believing it opened the mind to the wisdom of Odin himself. And though excess was expected, it was not entirely chaotic. A designated host, the symbol leader, oversaw the passing of the horn, ensuring that toasts maintained dignity and that the drinking strengthened bonds rather than fractured them. Under this guidance, Joel Me feasts became acts of cultural resilience. Within the longhouse, warmed by fire and fortified by honey drink, the Vikings pushed back against winter's darkness, creating light of their own making. As the me loosened tongues and the firelight softened the edges of the longhouse, another essential element of Joel emerged: storytelling. To the Vikings, words were more than entertainment. They were living things capable of shaping memory, identity, and even destiny. And honestly, I think this was one of the most powerful aspects of Viking culture. They didn't rely on books or libraries. Their history survived because people cared enough to speak it aloud year after year. The Skolds, those elite poets and keepers of law, commanded the room with a presence equal to any warrior. They carried sagas in their minds the way others carried blades, carefully, skillfully, and with a sense of responsibility. During Joel, when darkness pressed too close and the world felt uncertain, it was the Skulls who reminded everyone that their ancestors had faced the same fears and survived. In a way, they provided psychological armor. Personally, I think every society that survives hardship has its storytellers, people who translate suffering into something meaningful. The stories ranged from epic to intimate. One moment, the longhouse echoed with the thunder of Thor battling giants, and the next, it fell silent as tales of lost kin or heroic voyages stirred emotion. Children listened, wide-eyed, absorbing everything like snow-catching firelight. Adults nodded along, recognizing familiar themes. Courage in the face of winter, loyalty to kin, the fragile line between the mortal and divine. But these stories weren't ancient relics. They evolved with each telling. A scold might adapt a tale to comment on recent events, celebrate a local hero, or poke gentle fun at someone in the room. And this is something I personally admire. The Vikings understood that history isn't fixed. It's a conversation between past and present, shaped by the needs of the living. Storytelling during Joel also served a deeper purpose. It reminded the community that they belonged to something larger than themselves. In the dead of winter, when isolation could erode morale, sagas tied everyone together in a shared mythic universe. They reinforced values, preserved memory, and inspired hope. In my opinion, it's no coincidence that cultures with strong oral traditions often develop great resilience. They know how to turn fear into narrative, and narrative into strength. So, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls, the Vikings sat wrapped in the warmth of words, believing rightly that stories could outshine even the darkest night. While Joel was undeniably a time of feasting and revelry, at its core, it remained a spiritual observance. The Vikings understood winter not simply as a season, but as a cosmic event, one that demanded recognition from both humans and gods. And if I'm being honest, this worldview makes a lot of sense to me. When you live in a place where the sun practically disappears, you feel the weight of the cosmos in your bones. Central to Joel was the belief that the sun was struggling. Each shortening day was a sign that the forces of darkness, frost giants, chaotic spirits, cosmic entropy, were gaining ground. The rituals of Joel, especially during the solstice, were attempts to help the sun reclaim its strength. Torches, bonfires, and hearth flames weren't just sources of heat. They were symbolic beacons, tiny earthly echoes of the celestial fire they hoped would soon return. Communities gathered to offer prayers, food, and drink to the gods, especially Odin, Thor, and Freya. Odin was invoked for wisdom and protection, Thor for strength against the oppressive cold, and Freya for the promise of fertile lands when spring returned. Personally, I find it fascinating how Viking spiritual life blended practicality with myth. They prayed to the powers that controlled the things they needed most: warmth, food, and the safety of the clan. In a harsh environment, faith wasn't a luxury, it was a strategy. The solstice night itself held a heavy electric atmosphere. People watched the sky, listening for omens, believing that the veil between worlds grew thinner during Joel. Some expected visits from ancestral spirits. Others believed the gods rode across the night sky on the wild hunt, a stormy procession that could bless or terrify depending on one's fortune. And honestly, if you've ever been outside during a northern winter storm, you can understand why they imagined supernatural riders in the wind. It feels otherworldly. When the solstice passed and the sun began slowly to grow in strength again, the mood shifted. This turning point marked a psychological victory. The worst had passed. The light was returning. The offerings, prayers, and rituals hadn't just honored the gods. They had sustained the community through the mental darkness of winter. In this sense, Joel wasn't simply about worship. It was a festival of resilience, a reminder that even in the deepest night, renewal was already on its way. Beyond sacrifice, storytelling, and ritual, Joel was also a time for simple human joy, games, gifts, and the strengthening of bonds within the clan. And honestly, I think this is one of the most underrated aspects of Viking culture. We often imagine them as grim, stoic warriors, stomping through snow with axes in hand. But during Joel, they allowed themselves to be playful, generous, and even sentimental. Inside the longhouse, once the feasting settled into a warm hum, families turned to games. Some were competitive wrestling matches, board games like Hentafall, and strength tests that let young men show off after a few horns of mead. Others were humorous, designed to provoke laughter during a time of year when emotional warmth mattered just as much as physical heat. Children chased each other around the hearth, Adults teased one another, and even elders joined in with RE smiles. In my opinion, these moments of levity reveal more about Viking resilience than any saga of battle. They refused to let winter steal their humanity. Gift-giving was also part of the celebration. Unlike the lavish modern holiday rituals, Viking gifts were usually practical: carved wooden toys for children, warm mittens, new tools, ornaments, or simple charms for protection. Sometimes a beautifully crafted knife or a piece of jewelry changed hands, but the meaning mattered more than the object. Gifts symbolized appreciation, loyalty, and the reaffirmation of bonds that the clan depended on for survival. Honestly, I think this approach to gifts is much healthier than what we do today. Vikings weren't trying to impress. They were trying to strengthen relationships. There was also a tradition known as Elfblot, where families left out food or drink for household spirits, elves or landvetter, who were believed to guard the home. Whether people truly expected invisible beings to eat the offerings or simply wanted a symbolic gesture of gratitude, the practice created a sense of harmony between the human world and the unseen forces around them. I personally love this idea. It shows how the Vikings acknowledged that survival was never achieved alone, not even by humans. In the end, Joel's games and gifts weren't small side activities. They were emotional glue. They reminded the community that winter might be harsh, but life still held sweetness, humor, and companionship. In the darkest season, kinship became its own kind of light. Among all the symbols of Joel, fire stood tallest, both literally and spiritually. The Vikings understood fire as more than a source of heat. It was a living presence, a guardian against the creeping darkness that dominated their winters. And truthfully, I think they were onto something. Anyone who has sat beside a fire during a cold night knows that its warmth feels emotional as much as physical. It lifts the spirit in a way nothing else quite can. During Joel, households and entire communities lit great fires meant to echo the rebirth of the sun. Torches were carried in procession. Hearths were fed with fresh logs, and in some regions, a massive ulei log, often a whole tree trunk, was burned for days on end. Keeping the flame alive symbolized both endurance and continuity. If the fire survived the longest nights, so would the people. Personally, I love this symbolism. It turns the simple act of staying warm into a collective declaration of hope. The ulei log itself had layers of meaning. Some believed it protected the home from misfortune. Others thought the sparks flying upward carried blessings to the gods. Families saved ashes from the burnt log to scatter in fields, believing it would ensure fertile soil in spring. Even if we look at this practice through a modern lens, there's something beautiful about connecting winter rituals to future harvests. It shows how Vikings tied every moment, dark or bright, to the cycle of life. Fire also created a boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. As flames flickered against the longhouse walls, casting shifting shapes in the smoke, people believed the veil between worlds grew thinner. Ancestors might draw near. Wandering spirits might linger, and gods might watch unseen from the glow. And honestly, on a long winter night, filled with wind and cracking ice, I can imagine how easily the mind slips into that mystical space. Firelight has a way of making the world feel both smaller and larger at the same time. These fires, whether small hearth flames or towering bonfires, represented the Vikings' attempt to answer the darkness with light, not passively, but actively, almost defiantly. They couldn't control the sun's return, but they could create light of their own. And in many ways, that simple act is the essence of human resilience. When the world grows dark, we build a flame and decide to endure. While Joel was filled with warmth and celebration inside the longhouse, the world outside was believed to be far more unpredictable. Winter nights carried mysteries, and the Vikings felt that the boundaries between mortal and supernatural realms thinned during this season. One of the most dramatic beliefs tied to Joel was the Wild Hunt, a roaring spectral procession said to sweep across the sky, led by none other than Odin himself. And honestly, if you've ever stood outside during a violent winter storm, feeling the wind tear past you like galloping hooves, it's not hard to see where this idea came from. The Wild Hunt was a paradox. It was awe-inspiring, terrifying, and strangely comforting all at once. Odin, riding his 8-legged steed Sleipnir, was joined by slain warriors, restless spirits, and sometimes even mythic beasts. To witness it was considered dangerous. To ignore it was considered foolish. People stayed indoors, whispering prayers, and hoping the furious host would pass without taking someone along. Personally, I find this belief fascinating because it reflects how the Vikings interpreted nature. Storms weren't just weather, they were messages, warnings, or displays of divine power. But the Wild Hunt wasn't the only supernatural occurrence tied to Jol. Many Vikings believed ancestral spirits returned during this time, drawn to the warmth of the hearth and the offerings left in their honor. Families set aside food, drink, or a spare seat near the fire. Whether these gestures were meant literally or symbolically, they emphasized the connection between the living and the dead, a reminder that identity stretched beyond a single lifetime. Some households practiced rituals for house spirits, the Dire or Landvitir, believing that honoring them maintained harmony within the home. I personally love how balanced this worldview is. Instead of seeing spirits as threats, the Vikings often viewed them as partners, guardians of place, memory, and family fortune. The night sky itself became part of the mythic landscape. Strange lights, storms, and shifting clouds were interpreted as signs. The northern lights, which we now understand scientifically, were seen by many as reflections of Valkyries riding to battle. And honestly, I can't blame them. If you had no scientific explanation and saw the heavens ignite with shimmering green fire, warrior maidens riding across the sky would probably feel like a perfectly reasonable interpretation. In these beliefs, Jol became more than a seasonal festival. It became a cosmic drama, a reminder that humans were never truly alone in the winter dark. As winter slowly loosened its icy grip and the days began stretching toward spring, the spirit of Jol lingered. For the Vikings, the festival wasn't just a moment of celebration. It was a philosophical statement about what it meant to endure. And honestly, I think this is why Jol still fascinates us today. It wasn't built around luxury or abundance. It was built around scarcity, resilience, and the simple human need to create light in dark times. What makes Jol especially compelling is how it evolved. After Christianity spread across Scandinavia, many pagan customs blended seamlessly into emerging Christmas traditions. The timing of the festival, the feasts, the fires, even the idea of gift-giving, all found new homes within a Christian framework. But the old meanings didn't vanish. They hid beneath the surface, shaping the textures of winter celebrations across Northern Europe. Personally, I find this cultural blending beautiful. Instead of erasing the past, new traditions layered themselves on top, allowing people to carry forward both old and new identities. Take the Ule log, for example. Today, we think of it as a dessert or a decorative fireplace ritual. But its roots go back to Viking households feeding a massive wooden trunk into the hearth to keep the symbolic flame alive for days. Or consider the boar's head, once central to Friar's sacrifice, now echoed faintly in medieval English feasting customs. Even the idea of gathering, drinking, storytelling, and reaffirming bonds during the darkest days of winter is essentially unchanged. Humans still crave warmth and companionship when the world feels cold. The persistence of these traditions shows how deeply Jol resonated with the rhythms of human life. At its core, it was about hope, something every culture understands. The Vikings didn't celebrate because life was easy. They celebrated because life was hard. And in my opinion, that's the most powerful kind of celebration. It's defiant, it's emotional, it's a reminder that joy isn't the opposite of struggle. It's how people fight against it. Today, when we light candles, gather with loved ones, or tell old stories beside a winter fire, we're echoing impulses that are thousands of years old. We may no longer fear that the sun will disappear forever, but the instinct to push back against darkness remains, and that more than anything is the lasting legacy of Joel. A festival that taught people not just to survive the winter, but to transform it into something meaningful, communal, and profoundly human. To most people standing outside the walls, a medieval castle looked like a place of calm power, thick stone battlements, high towers, and a noble banner fluttering confidently above it all. But anyone who actually lived inside those walls, especially the guards, knew the truth. A castle was not a peaceful sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker built for war, paranoia, and constant readiness. And honestly, I think castle guards had one of the most stressful jobs of the entire medieval world. You weren't just protecting a building. You were protecting a symbol of authority, wealth, and political pride. That meant you couldn't afford a single mistake. A guard's day began early, often before sunrise, while the castle's kitchen stirred awake and craftsmen prepared their tools. The guards were already checking gear, tightening straps, sharpening blades, and reporting for inspection. The castle constable or sergeant oversaw assignments, deciding who would patrol the courtyard, who would watch the walls, who would stand at the gatehouse, and who would be sent to the towers. Rotations mattered. Too much monotony caused fatigue. Too much excitement bred carelessness. In my opinion, it's impressive how well medieval commanders understood human behavior long before formal psychology existed. Inside the walls, a guard had to be both visible and alert. Every merchant, messenger, visitor, or wandering servant was a potential threat. Even residents of the castle were not above suspicion. Guards watched for strange behavior, late-night prowling, or anyone lingering too close to restricted areas. More than one medieval plot unraveled because a sharp-eyed guard noticed something that just didn't look right. Meals were eaten quickly and often standing. Training drills occurred regularly. Archery, practice, weapon handling, formation exercises, and emergency response to alarms. A guard never really relaxed. He simply existed in varying degrees of readiness. And unlike the knights who rode into battle covered in honor and glory, guards were expected to do their jobs without fanfare. If everything went right, no one praised them. If anything went wrong, everyone blamed them. But the truth is, castles depended on these men far more than they depended on their knights. Guards were the ones who kept the peace, watched the gates, and maintained vigilance during the long stretches of quiet when danger felt distant but never disappeared. Their lives were a balance of routine, discipline, and the ever-present knowledge that even the calmest day could turn deadly in an instant. If the castle had a front line during peacetime, it was the gatehouse. This structure, often overlooked in movies, was the most strategically important choke point in the entire fortress. Every person, every cart, every animal, and every whisper of news passed through it. And honestly, I think gatehouse duty was both the most fascinating and the most nerve-wracking assignment a guard could receive. You were the castle's filter, deciding what entered its world and what stayed outside. The gatehouse was not just a doorway, it was an armored gauntlet. Guards stood on multiple levels, watching from arrow slits, tower windows, and parapets. Below them were murder holes, small openings in the ceiling that allowed boiling water, hot sand, or stones to rain down on intruders in case of attack. And yes, despite modern myths, hot oil was rarely used because it was expensive. Personally, I find this detail hilarious. Even in warfare, practicality trumped drama. At ground level, the main gate was reinforced with iron bands and backed by a heavy portcullis, a spiked metal grid that could slam down in seconds. The guard in charge of the winch had to be trusted completely. With one pull of a rope or release of a lever, he could allow entry, trap intruders, or seal the castle. The power and responsibility was enormous. Daily activity at the gatehouse was equally intense. As travelers arrived, guards asked questions. Who are you? Where are you coming from? What business do you have here? They checked carts for hidden weapons, demanded written permission for entry, and kept a close eye on anyone acting nervous or evasive. smugglers, spies, disgruntled peasants, opportunistic thieves. Anyone could be a threat, and in my opinion, this level of social filtering would drive most modern people insane. But for medieval guards, it was simply part of the job. Tension always rose when nobles visited. Their entourages created traffic jams, horses reared, servants panicked, and everyone, including the guards, was expected to show flawless discipline. One slip, one insult, even an accidental delay could lead to punishment. The gatehouse was also where news arrived first. Rumors of war, approaching envoys, outbreaks of plague, or sudden political drama. Guards learned bad news hours before the Lord did. In that sense, they were not just sentinels, they were the castle's early warning system. For a guard, the gatehouse was a test of instinct, discipline, and courage. It was the castle's handshake with the outside world, and sometimes its shield against it. Patrolling the castle walls was one of the most repetitive yet essential duties in a guard's life. Hour after hour, guards walked the battlements, stone pathways along the top of the walls, keeping watch for threats both near and far. It might sound simple, but wall patrols required sharp eyes, steady nerves, and an almost unnatural tolerance for boredom. Personally, I think this job was designed to break anyone who wasn't mentally tough. Too quiet, and you lost focus. Too eventful, and you probably died. The patrol route usually started at one corner tower and wound around the entire perimeter. Along the way, guards checked arrow slits, leaned over crenellations to observe the countryside, and scanned roads, forests, and fields for movement. A single figure approaching the castle could be harmless or could be a scout for a much larger force. Every shape on the horizon had to be analyzed. Every sound mattered. A barking dog, distant smoke, a flicker of torchlight. Each detail could signal danger. Patrols happened in every kind of weather. Blazing sun, freezing fog, sleet, rain, snow, and winds so strong they threatened to push a man right off the wall. And medieval walls offered no comfort. The stone was cold, the footing uneven, and the height terrifying for anyone with a hint of vertigo. I honestly admire the guards who managed to function up there without constantly imagining their own dramatic fall into the moat. But the physical challenge was only half the struggle. The mental strain was real. Hour-on patrols, repeated day after day, created a rhythm that lulled the senses. Guards had to fight the creeping numbness of routine. Missing a detail wasn't an option. Many castles introduced specific checkpoints or routine callouts to force guards to stay alert. A sergeant might appear unexpectedly to test a guard's awareness, ask what they'd seen, who was on the road, or whether smoke had risen from the nearby village. Fail the test, and you might find yourself on muck cleaning duty, or worse, on the night shift. Despite the monotony, patrols gave guards a unique understanding of the world beyond the castle. They knew the land, the traffic patterns, the weather shifts. They were the first to sense when something felt off. And, in medieval times, instinct was half the job. A guard on patrol had to blend discipline with intuition, scanning a landscape where danger could gather silently just beyond the trees. In the end, wall patrols were the castle's heartbeat, constant, vigilant, and utterly essential. If day patrols were tedious, night watches were downright brutal. Once the sun dipped behind the hills and the castle surrendered to darkness, everything changed. The air grew colder, sounds traveled farther, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. In my opinion, this was the most psychologically demanding part of a guard's life. Humans simply aren't built for vigilance in total darkness. Yet, medieval guards were expected to perform flawlessly. Night watches were divided into shifts, often lasting 2 to 4 hours. The goal was simple: prevent exhaustion, but never let the castle go unobserved. Guards positioned themselves on walls, in towers, and at the gatehouse, each holding a lantern or standing near a brazier for warmth. Light was both a blessing and a curse. It helped guards see, but it also made them visible targets. Many chose to stand half-hidden, letting their eyes adjust to the dark instead of relying on flickering flame. Sounds became the enemy. A loose stone falling from a wall, wind rustling through trees, a fox snaking across the outer yard. Any noise could be interpreted as a threat, and honestly, I can't blame them. In an age of constant warfare and sudden raids, paranoia was a survival skill. A guard who dismissed something strange might doom the entire castle to stay awake. Guards used tricks, biting their tongues, pacing in circles, whispering prayers, or rhythmically tapping their weapons. Falling asleep on duty was one of the most serious offenses imaginable. In some places, the punishment was public humiliation. In others, it was execution. And while that sounds harsh, a single sleeping guard could invite catastrophe. Night also masked the approach of spies or saboteurs. Intruders often moved under moonlight, hoping to slip through unguarded postern gates or shadowy corners of the wall. Guards had to be aware not only of what was outside the castle, but also what was inside. Sometimes the greater danger came from betrayal. Servants bribed to open doors, conspirators whispering in stairwells. I personally think this internal threat was even scarier. You could prepare for enemies outside. You couldn't prepare for a friend suddenly turning traitor. Despite the fear, guards adapted, their senses sharpened, their instincts refined. Over time, night itself became a familiar companion, a vast, silent battlefield they learned to navigate. And when dawn finally broke, painting the castle walls gold, every guard on duty felt a quiet triumph. Another night survived, another morning earned. In a world without electric lights, radios, or surveillance cameras, medieval castles relied heavily on systems of identification, passwords, signals, and coded routines that told guards who belonged and who absolutely did not. And honestly, I think this is one of the cleverest and most underrated parts of castle security. People imagine medieval warfare as pure brute strength, but the truth is intelligence and subtlety were just as important. The nightly password, sometimes called the watchword, was essential. Every guard on duty learned it at the start of the evening. Whispered from sergeant to soldier, always out of earshot of strangers. Anyone approaching after dark, whether a messenger, a patrolling guard, or even the castle lord himself, had to know the password. If they didn't, spears came down, arrows were knocked, and negotiations became very uncomfortable, very fast. Personally, I love how democratic this system was. Even a noble could be challenged by a low-ranking guard if protocol demanded it. But passwords weren't the only safeguard. Guards also used visual signals, a raised torch, a waved lantern, or a sequence of horn blasts. These allowed quick communication across the walls and courtyard. A single horn might signal a returning patrol. 2 horns could announce unknown visitors. 3 horns that usually meant trouble. The efficiency of this system always impresses me. Without technology, they still created reliable communication networks. There were also routines designed to expose imposters. Some castles required guards to walk specific paths at specific intervals. If a patrol didn't appear when expected, something was wrong. Others used call and response phrases shouted across battlements. One guard would call out a line and the next tower over responded with its matching phrase. This prevented attackers from quietly replacing or killing a watchman without detection. Inside the castle, servants and residents also needed ways to prove they belonged. Some wore tokens or badges. Others followed strict curfew rules. After dark, even familiar faces could be detained until verified. And in my opinion, this level of cautiousness shows how precarious medieval life really was. A moment of misplaced trust could bring down an entire fortress. These password systems weren't just bureaucratic rituals, they were life-saving tools. They prevented ambushes, stopped infiltrators, and empowered guards to challenge anyone, no matter their rank. In a time when disguise and deception were common tactics, the humble watchword might be the only thing standing between a quiet night and a deadly surprise. In short, Passwords kept everyone alive and kept castles from becoming crime scenes with good architecture. Castle towers were more than dramatic architectural features. They were nerve centers of surveillance. Anyone stationed in a tower lived in a world of wind, height, and relentless observation. And honestly, I think tower guards had one of the toughest psychological roles. You weren't in the bustle of the courtyard or the warmth of the gatehouse. You were alone, often cold, and staring at the horizon for hours, waiting for something, anything, to move. Each tower offered a unique vantage point. From the highest levels, a lookout could see villages, forests, roads, and sometimes even the shimmer of a river miles away. This panoramic view made towers the castle's early warning system. A plume of smoke, a distant dust cloud, or the glint of metal in the sunlight could all signal incoming trouble. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being the first person responsible for spotting an army before it reached your walls. Missed the signs, and the castle might have minutes, not hours, to prepare. Inside the tower, life was cramped. Stone walls trapped cold air, staircases spiraled tightly, and arrow slits allowed just enough space to see and shoot, but not enough to stay warm. Guards took turns warming their fingers near tiny braziers, trying not to lose mobility. Personally, I think frostbite was as much a threat as any enemy siege weapon. But comfort was a luxury. Medieval guards weren't allowed. Archers stationed in towers had even more responsibility. Their bows were the castle's first line of active defense. From above, they could rain arrows on attackers long before melee troops reached the gate. But archers needed incredible skill. Shooting from height meant adjusting for wind, angle, and distance. A single miscalculation wasted precious ammunition. And in a siege, arrows were as valuable as food. Communication between towers was vital. Guards used horn blasts, shouted signals, or lantern flashes to relay what they saw. A suspicious figure near the tree line, signal it. A caravan approaching, signal it. Something strange happening in the village, definitely signal it. Tower guards became experts at reading the landscape like a living map. Despite the solitude, there was a certain pride in tower duty. You were literally above everything, closer to the wind, the weather, and the first hints of danger. In my opinion, tower guards were the castle's eyes, and without them, every other defensive measure would crumble into chaos. Being in the tower meant vigilance, precision, and a constant awareness that the smallest detail could change everything. If towers were the castle's eyes, then murder holes were its teeth, small, unassuming, and absolutely lethal. These architectural features were built into gates, passageways, and choke points, allowing defenders to unleash chaos on invaders trapped below. And honestly, I think murder holes are one of the best reminders that medieval architects were not just builders. They were military strategists with surprisingly creative imaginations. A murder hole was usually a small square or circular opening in the ceiling above an entry passage. If attackers managed to breach the outer gate or batter down a door, they'd rush inside, often cheering, thinking they'd won the first stage of the siege. Then they'd find themselves funneled into a narrow corridor, jammed together, and suddenly drenched in hot sand, stones, boiling water, or even quicklime. Personally, I think the use of hot sand is the most underrated tactic. It got into armor gaps, stuck to sweaty skin, and caused burns that lasted for weeks. These openings didn't just appear by accident. Castle designers intentionally created killing zones, spaces engineered to trap attackers like insects in a bottle. The gatehouse was usually the worst of these. Defenders could fire arrows through arrow slits, pour liquids from murder holes, and drop heavy objects from hidden ledges. The geometry was brilliant, narrow enough to bottleneck enemies, tall enough to create vertical attack angles, and winding enough to confuse anyone charging forward. Trapdoors served a similar purpose. Some were simple wooden panels that could be pulled open to drop enemies into pits. Others were disguised beneath straw, dirt, or even decorative flooring. The goal wasn't always to kill, it was to separate, delay, or disorient attackers. Imagine running into a castle hallway, adrenaline pumping, and suddenly the ground beneath you disappears. It's chaotic, humiliating, and extremely effective. What I personally love about these features is how psychological they were. Even skilled soldiers hesitated before entering a castle's inner passages. They'd glance upward, tap the floor with a spear, or hug the wall to avoid imaginary traps. The fear alone slowed an assault significantly, buying defenders precious time. Murder holes and trapdoors weren't just gruesome, they were strategic masterpieces. They turned the castle itself into a weapon, allowing a handful of defenders to hold off dozens or even hundreds of attackers. And in a world where manpower was limited and sieges were brutal, that advantage could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. In short, medieval castles didn't play fair, and that was exactly the point. While castle walls and towers protected against armies outside, many medieval lords feared something far sneakier: threats from within. A castle was a small, bustling ecosystem. Servants, cooks, blacksmiths, cleaners, knights, visiting nobles, wandering musicians, clergy, merchants, messengers, stable boys, and prisoners. That meant one terrifying truth: if someone inside wanted to sabotage the place, they had endless opportunities. And honestly, I think this internal danger was far scarier than any siege engine parked outside the gate. Guards were trained not only to watch for enemies in the forests, but also for suspicious behavior in the halls. A servant loitering where they shouldn't be, a scribe suddenly taking an interest in guard rotations, a visiting merchant asking too many questions. Even trusted retainers could be bribed by rival lords. Medieval politics, after all, made modern office gossip look adorable in comparison. Because of this, guards patrolled the inside of castles just as rigorously as the outside. They monitored storerooms, checked locks, inspected the stables, and ensured that no one tampered with wells or food supplies. Poisoning was a very real fear. Some lords even had dedicated food tasters, which, if you ask me, might have been the most stressful job in the entire Middle Ages. Then there were the prisoners. Many castles kept dungeons, or holding cells deep within the structure. Guards had to ensure no one passed contraband to captives. No bribes exchanged hands, and no sympathetic servant helped a prisoner escape. A single loose brick or smuggled tool could become a disaster. Servants were both essential and risky. They had access to almost every room, including the lord's private quarters. Many were loyal, but loyalty could change with hunger, fear, or a better offer. In my opinion, this is the part of medieval life we romanticize least, but should understand most. Castles functioned because hundreds of people cooperated, yet any one of them could become a vulnerability. Information security was just as important as physical security. Guards enforced rules about who could overhear council meetings, who handled letters, and who approached the Lord during rest hours. Even casual gossip could start a rebellion if the wrong person overheard it. Internal security wasn't glamorous. There were no epic battles, no heroic last stands, just constant vigilance and quiet suspicion. But without it, castles would have fallen far more often. Because sometimes the deadliest enemy didn't need a siege tower, just a smile, a bribe, or a well-timed opportunity. And personally, I think that's the most unsettling truth of all. For all the architecture, weapons, routines, and protocols, the true heart of castle security was the guards themselves, the men who lived every day on the edge of danger. Their world was built on discipline, instinct, and trust. And honestly, I think this human element gets overlooked far too often. Stone walls didn't protect a castle, people did. The walls were only as strong as the guards standing on them. Life as a castle guard meant accepting a strange balance. Long stretches of mind-numbing routine interrupted by moments of absolute terror. One day you were pacing the courtyard, bored out of your mind, staring at chickens and gossiping servants. The next day, the alarm horns were blaring, arrows were flying, and every decision you made determined who lived and who didn't. That kind of emotional whiplash shaped guards into practical, sharp-witted survivors. Camaraderie was essential. Guards depended on each other the way sailors depend on crewmates. You learned who could keep calm under pressure, who had the sharpest eyes, who cracked jokes to break tension, and who might panic during a crisis. In my opinion, this bond was one of the few things that made the job bearable. You weren't alone on the walls. You had brothers beside you. Training reflected this reality. Guards drilled constantly, practicing formations, rehearsing alarm responses, reviewing escape routes, and testing weapons. Some castles held mock invasions to simulate surprise attacks. Others focused on communication drills, horn signals, torch patterns, shouted commands. The goal was simple. When chaos hit, no one should hesitate, and no one should misunderstand an order. In an era without radios, clarity was everything. But beneath the discipline, there was always an undercurrent of fear. Everyone knew the castle could be attacked at any time before dawn during a festival, while the lord was away or in the middle of dinner. And not all threats came from armies. Fires, disease, outbreaks, famines, and political treachery could destabilize a castle from the inside just as effectively as battering rams from the outside. Personally, I think medieval guards lived in a constant state of controlled anxiety, always scanning, always listening, always preparing for the worst. Yet, despite the danger, castle guards created stability in a world that rarely offered any. Their vigilance kept families safe, protected precious resources, and upheld the fragile sense of order medieval society needed to survive. They weren't knights, they weren't celebrated heroes, but without them, castles were nothing more than pretty stone sculptures waiting to fall. In the end, castle guards lived on a razor's edge, but they held the line day after day, night after night. And that unshakable dedication is what truly kept the medieval world standing. Before the sun even cleared the rooftops of the Suburra, Rome's poorer districts were already alive. Wooden shutters slammed open, fenders dragged carts onto uneven stone streets, and the smell of yesterday's smoke lingered beneath the morning air. For plebeians, laborers, porters, washerwomen, scribes, freedmen, the market wasn't a luxury. It was where you bought your food for the day, because almost no one had storage space at home. And honestly, I think this alone tells you everything about daily Roman life. Survival was a daily negotiation. Bread sellers opened earliest. The moment their ovens released the first round loaves, customers crowded around, some still tying their tunics, others clutching a single bronze coin that determined whether they'd eat that morning. Beside them, fruit vendors arranged piles of figs, dates, and olives on rough wooden boards. Nothing was washed. Nothing was polished. Rome didn't do presentation. If it was edible, someone would buy it. The noise built quickly. Boys shouted prices at the top of their lungs. Women haggled so aggressively it sounded like an argument, and animals bleated, snarled, or clucked depending on which stall you passed. And mixed into all this were pickpockets, small, agile, fearless. Personally, I think Roman markets trained thieves better than any criminal school ever could. One moment you were admiring fresh grapes, the next your purse was gone. Water sellers wandered between stalls with sloshing buckets because street fountains weren't always safe. The city was huge, pipes leaked, and contamination was constant. Clean water was a gamble. Cheap wine, surprisingly, was often safer than water, which explains why so many Romans walked around slightly buzzed before noon. Every sense was assaulted. The clang of metal cups, the bark of vendors, the smell of frying fish or roasting nuts, the sting of smoke from charcoal braziers. Rome was never quiet, never still. But beneath the chaos was rhythm, the strange order only locals understood. Everyone had their preferred stall, their trusted seller, their daily routine. And for plebeians, the market was more than a place to shop. It was where news spread, gossip flourished, alliances were made, and life unfolded one noisy morning at a time. In a city of 1,000,000 souls, the market was the beating heart, and it started pumping before the sun even thought about rising. If the open-air stalls were the lungs of the Roman market, the tabernae were its stomach. Narrow, smoky, always packed, and always loud. These tiny street shops lined major roads and alleyways, each one barely large enough for a counter. A few clay jars and a very sweaty owner shouting over customers. Honestly, I think Rome invented fast food culture centuries before modern cities. They just replaced plastic wrappers with wooden bowls and swapped soda for cheap watered wine. Inside a taberna, you'd find food that was hot, simple, and filling. Lentil stew, grilled sausages, olives soaked in brine, fried fish, chickpea porridge, leftover cuts of meat simmering in wine sauce, or flatbread sprinkled with herbs. Most plebeians didn't have kitchens at home. No ovens, no space, sometimes not even a proper hearth. So, street food wasn't a treat, it was survival. A day without a tab and a meal usually meant a day without eating. The smell hit you first. Smoke from charcoal braziers mixed with garlic oil and the slightly worrying scent of fish that probably should have been sold yesterday. Personally, I think Roman food safety standards would give modern health inspectors a heart attack. But Romans had strong stomachs, or at least they pretended to. The venom, or cheap wine, was everywhere, served in clay cups from massive amphoe. It was almost always diluted, flavored with herbs, or mixed with honey. Pure unwatered wine was considered barbaric, something only Celts or drunks would drink. Still, to burn a wine was notorious for being low quality, often fermented too long or mixed with questionable additives. But for a few coins, it warmed your chest and helped you forget you lived in a noisy tenement that might collapse at any moment. Honestly, who could blame them? Tabernae were social hubs too. Laborers discussed wages, gamblers argued over dice games, and street philosophers preached loudly to anyone who didn't ask. It was messy, crowded, and borderline unhygienic. But it was where life happened. Deals were made. Fights broke out. Friendships were forged over steaming bowls of stew. And hovering somewhere in the background, thieves, always thieves. A distracted eater was easy prey, and crowded spaces made escape effortless. In the end, the taberna was more than a place to eat. It was where the city's pulse could be felt, tasted, and smelled. Rome may have ruled an empire, but it survived one bowl of street stew at a time. If you want to understand Roman street life, don't look at the buildings, look at the vendors. They were the true soundtrack of the city, shouting prices, praising their goods, insulting competitors, and doing everything short of physical combat to get customers' attention. Honestly, I think Roman vendors would put modern salespeople to shame. They had no microphones, no advertisements, no neon signs, just lungs powerful enough to terrify birds out of trees. Every vendor had a strategy. Fish sellers bragged about freshness, even when the smell insisted otherwise. Fruit sellers stacked their figs in precise pyramids because presentation meant everything. Olive sellers let customers sample one or two, then guilt-trip them into buying a whole bowl. Bakers flashed warm loaves like treasure, letting the steam rise dramatically into the air. And spice merchants, they were the tricksters of the market, boasting that their imported pepper came from India when it probably came from a warehouse down the street. Prices were never fixed. Haggling was expected. A seller would start absurdly high. The customer would counter insultingly low. And the whole negotiation turned into a theatrical performance. Passers-by watched for fun. Children placed bets. In Rome, buying food wasn't a transaction. It was entertainment. Of course, vendors weren't just loud. They were territorial. A newcomer setting up too close could spark a shouting match. Or, in some cases, a full-blown brawl with bread rolls used as projectiles. Honestly, I'd pay to watch a Roman bakery fight. Many vendors were former slaves, buying their freedom, or immigrants from the provinces trying to make a living in the empire's busiest city. Their stalls reflected their backgrounds. Greeks selling honey cakes, Syrians offering sesame treats, Egyptians preparing spiced beans. Rome was chaotic, but it was also surprisingly cosmopolitan. In a single street, you could taste half the Mediterranean world, but beneath the colors and noise was desperation. Vendors had to sell enough each day to survive tomorrow. There were no safety nets, no guaranteed wages. Illness meant no income. Bad weather meant hungry children. Rome's glamour rested on the backs of people who hustled from dawn to dusk, praying they sold enough olives or wine or fish before the day turned sour. And yet, despite the struggle, vendors kept the city fed. Without them, Rome's million residents simply couldn't function. Markets weren't just places of commerce, they were lifelines. And the vendors were the ones holding the city together, one shouted sale at a time. If you walked through a Roman market at midday, your stomach made decisions before your brain did. The smell of sizzling meat, frying dough, and spiced chickpeas filled the air so thickly that even the gods on Olympus might feel jealous. Rome was a city that ran on street food, not because people loved convenience, but because most had no kitchens. And honestly, I think the Romans perfected grabango millennia before it became a modern trend. Vendors cooked on portable braziers, sending curls of smoke into the hot, dusty streets. The most popular meals were simple but flavorful. Grilled sausages wrapped in bread, lentil stews, barley porridge, fried fish, stuffed dates coated in honey, and roasted nuts. Romans weren't picky. If it filled your stomach and didn't poison you, it was good enough. One of the biggest crowd pleasers was thermopolium food, the ancient equivalent of a fast food counter. These shops had stone counters with embedded jars filled with hot dishes kept warm by coals underneath. You'd walk up, point at something bubbling, and a ladle full of it ended up in your bowl. Personally, I think they deserve far more credit. They were basically the ancestors of every modern food stall, diner, and street cart rolled into one. And then there was wine, cheap, sour, often watered down and flavored with herbs. A cup cost barely anything, which is probably why half the city spent afternoons slightly tipsy. But given how stressful Roman street life was, I can't blame them. Of course, with every good thing came danger. Food wasn't regulated. Vendors reused oil until it turned black. Fish sat in the sun longer than any reasonable person would tolerate. Meat skewers were sometimes more bone than meat. I'm convinced that surviving Roman cuisine required a digestive system forged in fire. The truly unlucky got sick. The truly experienced just shrugged and kept eating. But the real charm of Roman street food wasn't the taste. It was the atmosphere. Crowds jostled, cooks shouted orders, children begged for scraps, musicians played for coins, and the aroma of spices like cumin and coriander drifted through the chaos. Food connected everyone: slaves, freedmen, citizens, foreigners, beggars, soldiers, merchants. In a world where life was unpredictable and often harsh, street food provided something consistent, comforting, and communal. It gave flavor to the struggle of daily life and kept the city alive, one sizzling skewer at a time. If the Roman Forum was the political brain of the empire, then the street markets were its beating, chaotic heart. To walk through one was to surrender your senses completely. Sight, sound, smell, all overwhelmed at once. Honestly, I think a time traveler would last about 5 minutes before begging for earplugs and fresh air. The noise came first. Vendors yelling prices, bakers shouting that their bread was still warm, fishmongers screaming over each other to convince customers their catch was fresh from Austria, even though everyone knew half the fish had spent the night in a bucket of questionable water. Add in children laughing or crying, donkeys braying, dogs barking, and the occasional drunk rambling about politics, and you had a soundscape that made modern city traffic seem peaceful. Then came the crowds. People didn't walk in straight lines. They flowed like water in unpredictable currents. One moment you were squeezed between two women balancing baskets on their heads. The next, a legionary cut straight through the middle of the street, as if he owned the place, which, to be fair, Romans sort of believed soldiers did. Personally, I think navigating Roman markets deserves recognition as an Olympic sport. Dodging carts, stepping over spilled olives, avoiding loose chickens. Your reflexes had to be sharp. Smells layered themselves like a complex perfume gone horribly wrong. Fresh fruit mixed with rotting fruit. Hot stew mixed with animal manure. Sweat mixed with incense sold by traveling Syrians. Rome smelled like life, death, food, labor, and ambition blended into one unforgettable aroma. In a strange way, I admire it. Romans didn't strive for sterility. They embraced the mess because it was honest. And within the chaos came moments of pure theater. An argument over the price of figs could escalate into a street-wide shouting match. A random musician might decide today was the day to debut a new instrument. A storyteller gathered a crowd with tales of heroes, only to be drowned out by a passing cart full of Every second, something new happened. But beneath the overwhelming noise and commotion, the market had a rhythm, almost like a living creature. People depended on this chaos to survive. It fed them, employed them, entertained them, connected them. Yes, Roman markets were loud, filthy, and exhausting, but they were also vibrant, social, and full of human energy. And in my opinion, they were the closest thing the ancient world had to a city's soul, raw, unfiltered, and alive. If the Roman street market was a living creature, then thieves were the parasites clinging to its skin, persistent, clever, and impossible to eliminate. Petty crime wasn't a side effect of market life, it was built into it. With thousands of bodies pressed together and coin purses dangling from belts, the place was a paradise for pickpockets. And honestly, I think Roman thieves deserved a degree in criminal innovation because some of their methods were disturbingly impressive. The most common thieves were children, fast, small, and underestimated. They slipped through crowds like fish in water. A bump on the elbow, a tug on the sleeve, a fake stumble, and suddenly your purse was halfway across the street. Older thieves worked in coordinated teams. One distracted you with conversation, another blocked your view, and a third plucked the goods. It was organized chaos, and in my opinion, modern scammers would admire the efficiency. Market guards existed, of course. They strolled around with clubs, glaring suspiciously at anyone who looked too alert or too relaxed. But guards couldn't be everywhere. Rome was enormous, and crime moved faster than authority ever could. Some victims shouted for help, fur thief, but by the time the crowd reacted, the culprit was long gone, vanished into a maze of alleys and stairwells. Vendors themselves were not innocent either. Some cheated with rigged scales, hollowed out weights, or dampened grain that cost more by the pound. A fishmonger might sprinkle water on old fish to make them shine. A fruit seller might bury rotten figs under a layer of fresh ones. Personally, I find this darkly amusing. Everyone was trying to survive, even if it meant bending a few ethical lines. But thieves didn't just steal goods, they stole opportunities. A hungry family might lose their dinner money in an instant. A laborer might lose the week's wages before he even reached home. Crime wasn't just annoying, it was devastating. And yet, there was a strange acceptance about it. Romans understood that a crowded city bred competition not only for food and work, but also for luck, comfort, and security. Some people fought back. Merchants hired guards. Shoppers kept coins hidden under tunics or in sandals. Parents warned children to stay close, but the market was too big, too alive, too unpredictable to ever be truly safe. And maybe that's what made it irresistible. In the Roman street market, every step was a gamble. You could walk away with a basket full of food, or missing half the money you walked in with. Danger and necessity danced together in every crowded street. If you ever dream of stepping into ancient Rome, let me give you a gentle reality check. The city did not smell like marble temples and clean linen. It smelled like humanity, thick, pungent, overwhelming humanity. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the street markets. Personally, I think modern people romanticize Rome way too much. If you dropped them into a real Roman market for 5 minutes, half would faint and the other half would run back to the time machine. Let's start with the streets themselves. Rome had hundreds of thousands of residents, But no garbage trucks, no sewer grates, and no citywide cleaning schedule. Waste piled up in corners. Food scraps rotted on stone, and stray animals wandered around, contributing their own gifts. Add in spilled wine, fish guts, urine. Yes, public urination was completely normal, and smoke from 1,000 charcoal braziers, and the air became a swirling cloud of smells, both delicious and horrifying. The noise wasn't any gentler. People shouted constantly, not because they were angry, but because you simply couldn't hear otherwise. Vendors hollered prices, children screamed while playing tag, carts rattled over stones, dogs barked, and the occasional rooster crowed loudly for absolutely no reason. And since Rome had no noise regulations whatsoever, the market was a sound explosion from dawn to dusk. Honestly, I think Romans developed superior lungs and thicker patience just by living there. And then there was the filth underfoot. Sludge formed where water runoff mixed with organic waste. Sandals slipped. Tunics got dirty. You had to watch where you stepped, and even then, you'd probably step in something questionable. Public slaves sometimes swept, but only when someone complained loudly enough. Otherwise, Rome relied on sun, time, and sheer optimism to deal with its mess. Yet, and here's the strange part, people loved the markets anyway. The smells and noise were part of the rhythm of Roman life. They meant the city was alive, not dying. They meant trade was moving, fires were burning, pots were cooking, animals were living. To Romans, discomfort was simply the price of civilization. From a modern perspective, it sounds chaotic, maybe even unbearable. But from a Roman perspective, this was the pulse of the empire. Filthy, loud, crowded, and full of opportunity. In its own messy way, the market's filth was a reminder of Rome's greatest paradox. The world's most powerful empire was built on streets that smelled like yesterday's fish stew and donkey dung. For all its chaos, filth, and noise, the Roman street market wasn't just a place to buy figs or haggle over olives. It was the empire's unofficial social network. If a plebeian wanted to know who got elected, who got exiled, who got divorced, who died, or who embarrassed themselves at last night's dinner party, they didn't read a newspaper. They went to the market. And honestly, I think the market functioned better than half the political institutions Rome ever created. Every morning, gossip flowed faster than wine at a banquet. Women gathered around fruit stalls to trade rumors about neighbors. Men, waiting for bread, updated each other on Senate debates, usually exaggerated beyond recognition. Retired soldiers boasted loudly about battles they never fought. Slave dealers and tradesmen overheard everything and repeated it twice as loudly. Rome didn't just spread news, it performed it. Politics seeped into conversations, whether you liked it or not. Supporters of rival candidates argued over grain prices, taxation, military campaigns, and which politician was secretly sleeping with whose wife. These debates could get heated, sometimes too heated. Fistfights in the middle of the market were treated like spontaneous entertainment. Personally, I think Romans invented political commentary by accident. Half their arguments sound exactly like modern online comment sections. But the market wasn't only about drama. It was also where relationships formed. Fishermen sold regularly to the same tavern keepers. Olive farmers recognized loyal customers. Freed men worked to find jobs. Mothers arranged marriages or made alliances. The market stitched the community together in a way temples and government buildings never could. Performers also flocked here. Jugglers, flute players, storytellers, snake handlers, and even amateur philosophers used the crowds to earn a few coins, or at least a bit of attention. Kids followed them around, half amazed, half terrified. If someone made a witty joke or played a clever tune, word traveled fast. Fame in Rome didn't come from social media. It came from being loud, creative, and standing in the right part of the market at the right time. And then there were the fortune tellers. They read omens from birds or tossed pebbles in patterns, predicting fortunes for anyone willing to pay a few coins. Personally, I think they were masters of improvisation. No matter what you asked, they they had a mystical-sounding answer ready. In the end, the market wasn't just where Romans bought food, it was where they lived socially. It was a theater of human behavior, a political battleground, a rumor factory, and a community center, disguised as chaos. For the average Roman, it wasn't optional, it was essential. At the end of the day, the Roman street market was more than noise, filth, food, gossip, and thieves. It was a battlefield for survival. Every plebeian who stepped into that crowded maze faced a simple truth. If you didn't fight for your place in the market, you didn't eat. And honestly, I think this relentless, daily struggle shaped Roman identity far more than their grand marble monuments ever did. Plebeians lived on razor-thin margins. Most earned their wages per day, not per week, which meant every morning began with uncertainty. A bad day at work meant a thin dinner. A missed day meant no dinner at all. The market was where this economic reality became painfully obvious. You bought only what you could afford, usually enough for a single meal. Food was never taken for granted, it was earned. People learned to stretch their coins as creatively as possible. Older vegetables sold cheaper in the afternoon. Fishmongers lowered prices before closing to avoid throwing food out. Bakers offered yesterday's bread for a discount. Watching Romans navigate these choices feels incredibly familiar, like seeing ancient roots of modern paycheck-to-paycheck living. Personally, I find it strangely comforting to see how ancient people dealt with the same struggles we do. Making budgets, searching for bargains, and hoping today's money lasts until tomorrow. The market also reflected social inequality with painful honesty. Wealthy Romans rarely set foot here. They sent slaves instead. Meanwhile, the poor wove through the crowds themselves, bargaining fiercely for every coin. A patrician might never know the smell of rotten fruit underfoot, but a plebeian knew it intimately. They lived close to the ground, literally and figuratively. But despite the hardship, the market was full of resilience. You saw it in the baker, who laughed through exhaustion, the widow, who haggled fearlessly, the fisherman who arrived before dawn, hoping for a decent sale. You saw it in the kids who ran barefoot between stalls, turning poverty into play. Rome liked to brag about its military victories, but in my opinion, its real triumph was the endurance of ordinary people who carved out a life in a city that rarely made things easy. As the day wound down, stalls closed, leftovers were swept into gutters, and the smell of charcoal faded from the air. The market grew quiet, but only until dawn. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. The shouting, the bargaining, the cooking, the stealing, the surviving. Rome didn't run on emperors or senators. It ran on these everyday struggles. And in the chaotic heartbeat of the street market, you can still hear the spirit of the empire's millions. Stubborn, hungry, resilient.